All right, it's no surprise if you're a living person, I would say in America, but it seems like pretty much in the world, and you're in your 20s and you're in your 30s, you're in a relationship, and it's time to have a baby. People aren't having babies, and it could be for education reasons, it could be for financial reasons, it could be all of the above or a combination of both. But there was a video titled Not Just You, No One Wants Kids Anymore. It's by Fads. I've been enjoying these reaction pieces online because some people create some really good stuff, and I just like sharing my response on it. So let's figure out why no one wants to have kids, or at least why Fads thinks no one wants to have kids. And let me move this. Let's be a professional over here.
The US fertility rate drops to another historic low. Births in Japan hit record low. Italy's national birth rate is declared a national emergency. Nearly every country is due to shrink by 2100. There's little to no doubt that there's like an ongoing fertility crisis.
And this is like the great reduction theory, where people have this theory that governments across the world, mainly run by the World Economic Forum, the WEF, on the reduction population theory, which is that they're strategically reducing the Earth's population. That way it's easier to control the masses.
People are choosing to not have babies anymore. From South Korea to the United States to Norway to Taiwan, pretty much every rich country. And you might not think this is a problem, but it is a problem for a few reasons. The reality is that people are living longer than ever at the moment.
True.
When people start to live this long, you need new workers to replace the ones that are retiring. You need new workers to pay taxes that will eventually fund the pensions of those who retire. And you need young people in the workforce to take care of those older people. In the 1960s, there were 6 people of working age for every retired person. And by 2035, it's expected to be 2 to 1. This is one of those topics where if you ask 5 different people, you'll get 5 completely different.
And you will get 5 completely different answers. But here, it says right here, the World Economic Forum. Boom. And then now that the ratio is closer to 3 to 1. So it's literally been cut to half. And expected by 20 to 35, it's going to be 2 to 1. So people need to be having kids. But why aren't we having kids?
Different answers as to what the reason is. People tend to have quite strong opinions. Some people might say it's a cost of living issue. Some people might say that it's to do with declining rates of religion in the world. Some people might blame women's liberation movements, for example. Either way,
women are going out getting jobs, and instead of wanting to be home and be mothers, they're more career or goal driven. I look at Tia Claire Toomey, who just won the CrossFit Games, who's a mother who had a kid and came back. I think if we look at the outliers, if we look at the small few, and maybe we're just throwing out the baby with the bathwater is ultimately what I'm trying to say.
No matter what people say, they're typically pretty certain that either their experience or their belief is the reason why on a global scale people aren't having children. I think we can do better than that, because when I see that there's a problem that is affecting Norway, the US, Taiwan, and France, I tell myself that there's got to be like a better answer that we can give, right? Because these countries are completely different. The childcare situation, for example, in Norway is vastly different to the childcare situation in the US, which is vastly different to the UK. So I feel like we can get a better answer than just this one-line solution of, oh, it's the cost of living. I think we can do better. If you'd asked me, to be honest, like even just a couple of weeks ago, I would have put the blame squarely on the cost of housing. In fact,
I would do cost of housing, education, definitely a little bit of, women going out and going to the workplace, even though that's not a bad thing. But I think it's just an overall shift in our culture. I would say in America, but obviously this is a world problem. But so is it a shift in culture, like this, like world, almost hive mind mentality of less about a community and more about the self?
There's this one chart that lives like in my head rent free. It's a chart that compares the growth of house prices to the growth of incomes in the UK. And intuitively, to me, it feels like that's why people wouldn't want to have kids. And to a lot of people, it feels that way. But I want to challenge my intuition, and maybe we can reach a more nuanced answer as to why this is more of a global problem than necessarily a specific localized problem. For example, this is a piece of research from the US, which tried to establish what the effect of a $10,000 increase in housing would be on people's decision to have kids. Unsurprisingly, if house prices go up, it corresponds to a 2.4% drop in the decision to have kids if you are renting. However, if you own your home, you actually become more likely to have kids as house prices go up. The net
Well, yeah, you're more stable, and as the house prices go up, and you have a house, that means your net worth, your assets, your worth goes up. So it makes sense to have a kid. Well, it doesn't make sense to have a kid, but like the stress of worrying about stability of where you're going to raise the kid is no longer, hovering over you.
Effect of this is that when house prices go up in the US, more people actually want to have kids, which is really counterintuitive. But there is some variance because in the UK, the effect of increasing house prices is a net decrease. And this is just one piece of evidence that immediately helps us understand that we can't just think of this problem as a one-line solution. Clearly, housing can't explain the full picture. I think the cost of having children is another huge factor that people typically fall back on when they explain the reasons why people aren't having kids. It's too expensive. However, it seems that even paying people to have kids isn't working very well. Taiwan spent more than $3 billion trying to get its citizens to have more children, and it's had no success at all. In France, they've spent even more money, about 4% of their GDP, on various measures to encourage people to have children. To put this into perspective, if the US spent 4% of its GDP on family measures, that would be the equivalent of the entire defense budget. So countries are actually, some countries at least, are actually spending a huge amount of money on things like tax breaks, things like direct cash transfers, and things like childcare benefits to encourage people to have kids. So clearly there's a bit more to this whole situation than meets the eye initially. And I think we can maybe look at some of the research and evidence, because there is a whole body of research and evidence to engage with. And I've tried to find the best bits to share it with you. And I'm curious to hear what your opinions are on these different aspects. What I do find really interesting is like how the narrative has changed around this topic, because a couple of decades ago, overpopulation was all the rage. All of the discussion around the number of people on Earth.
This is like, if you're 30 like me, this is right around the time we're in like middle school, like going into high school. Everyone was worried like we're gonna run out of resources. We gotta stop having kids.
Revolved around the fact that there were too many people, and we have two people to blame for this. First of all, we have this dude here. His name is Thomas Malthus, and he is an 18th century economist. And he was the first major figure to really write about this idea of a population boom. He saw that the quality of life in 18th century England was dropping pretty quickly, and he said that there was just too many people and that we'd get to a point where there wouldn't be enough food to sustain the growing population. And a couple of decades later, another professor wrote about the same topic. His name was Paul Ehrlich, and he wrote a book called The Population Bomb. And people really believed him. To kind of put into perspective how scared people were of overpopulation, I want to share a quote by the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the US, who said that overpopulation could be more explosive than the atomic or hydrogen bomb. Even on the other side of the world, in China, these fears of overpopulation promoted China's decision to implement their one-child policy, the whole package of laws and regulations designed to stop Chinese people from having more than one child.
And this was that, like, if they had two kids, it's not like they killed. They're like, choose one kid, he shall survive. It's like if they were born, if you were naturally born with, twins or something like that, then you had twins. But I'm pretty sure it was something crazy along the lines like, hey, you're only allowed to have one, so somebody's either got to get snipped or tied, which is a crazy law to enforce. Now, I could be just saying straight propaganda because I'm over here in America. I'm not in China, so, this is what the hearsay, but holy shit, imagine if that was the case. It's like the doctor's like, all right, congratulations. Who's going in for surgery?
If we fast forward to today, those fears were like clearly unfounded. I think most of us understand that food insecurity is a distribution problem and not an agriculture problem. And instead,
I also think it is a population problem. There is some underlying truth if the area that you're in can only hold so many people and you're kind of at max capacity, then it does become a population problem. But definitely for sure we have a lot of back-asswards thinking on how we handle our agriculture and the distribution of our agriculture.
We've ended up in the situation where underpopulation is the problem, where there are not enough young people. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the US specifically, because I think they've got some really interesting factors that paint a different picture of the fertility crisis to the one that you might have in your head at the moment. This is a graph of the US fertility rates, and it's the kind of graph that makes you want to jump to a specific conclusion or a one-line answer as to what's going on here. But the real interesting part of this graph isn't what it looks like now. It's what it looks like when you kind of break it down by demographics. And thankfully, The Economist has done this for me. If we look at birth rate divided by age, we see some really interesting trends. Somewhat surprisingly, the fertility rate amongst women over 30 has actually been steadily rising since the 1990s. However,
that just means to me people are waiting till they're more stable and more developed and more mature in life to have kids.
You might see something else that's quite interesting. Birth rates amongst 15 to 19-year-old women in the US dropped dramatically. The actual figure is 77%. And they actually explain that more than half of the drop in America's total fertility rate is driven by women under 19 choosing to no longer have kids. Around a third of these births would have been unplanned, and the majority of these births would have been on low incomes as well. In the UK, we actually see a similar trend where women at age 20 are having half as many children. Unlike richer women, these young women are not going to compensate by having more kids in the future. And
isn't that just an overall education thing? Like as a species, we are becoming more aware that like, hey, having kids, it's a big responsibility. And I'm not mature enough. I haven't done the things I wanted to do in life. I'm not stable enough. I haven't found somebody who I think I'm going to love for the rest of my life. I don't even really know what that statement even means. I'm trying to say this is like somebody who's like 16 and pregnant. Like we had a whole series on this. You guys remember on MTV? We had 16 and pregnant. There was a whole thing about this, and it glamorized it a little bit. But if anything, it just showed the harsh reality of like, yo, you're 16. You have to get a job. All the dreams that you thought you had, you can't have them now, because now you have to make sure that this new life that you brought in, it has a better life than you did, or at least that should be the responsibility you bestow upon yourself.
I actually want to like take a brief second to have a little aside and talk about the fact that often the most vilified group of people are actually the most important group of people to society. I'm sure you've heard young single mothers described as a burden on society or as lazy, but clearly...
Who the fuck says that? That's just rude.
These women were actually like the backbone of the economy. It's an aspect that I feel many people don't actually think about. Obviously, it would be unreasonable to say that the reason that...
That's just some simp-ass, loser-ass dudes in their rooms who are just like, yeah, single women are the fucking problem. They're putting a burden on the economy.
No one is having kids is purely because teen pregnancies are down. The economic aspect of it is clearly like important. It's clearly relevant. I don't think it's a coincidence if you look in this graph that the countries that have the lowest fertility rate in Europe, countries like Italy, Spain, and Greece, are also the countries with the highest youth unemployment, the countries where young people live with their parents for the longest, and the economy is in the bin, basically. And if you just ask young adults why they're not having kids, a lot of them will say that it's simply because childcare is too expensive. What I do find interesting, though, is that the fertility crisis is one that affects the whole world, and it affects countries that spend an incredible amount of money on social programs for kids. So this is a quote by Robert Reich. If you don't know who Robert Reich is, he was US Secretary of Labor. He says that Norway spends around $30,000 per child on early childhood care. Finland spends $23,000. Germany spends $18,000. And the US spends $500 per child. Obviously, the US has a huge childcare spending problem. It just doesn't want to invest in young children. But no.
But I thought our taxes went into stuff like this. You're telling me they're just going to Ukraine? You're telling me my money is funding a war I don't even want to fund?
Which is spending incredible amounts on early childhood care, is still seeing a below replacement birth rate. And when we talk about this problem, we tend to lump men and women in together as if their experience of having children is identical, when there are actually some pretty significant differences that can at least help us explain some more of the trend towards choosing to not have children. And one of these big factors is the fact that women's earnings drop significantly after having a child. And that drop persists decades after they have children. Yep. This is not so much of a problem for men. Men who choose to have kids don't earn significantly less than men who don't choose to have kids. And they don't also experience a short-term drop in the amount that they earn.
I'd be curious to see an updated chart on this because I feel like now women can get back into the workforce, and we're seeing, women take leadership roles. In fact, in my industry where I'm working, I'm thinking quite literally. I think the CEO is a dude. Every other head leadership position is filled by a woman, and those are all extremely high-paying jobs. Now, granted, I don't know if all of them have kids or anything, but I could assume that, like, hey, you have a kid, you stop working. So this is that sharp decrease in work. And this is going to be that rebound phase of you getting back into the job. Okay, you've landed back on your feet. We're seeing this. And then I'm curious to see what this little dip and this would really be about. Because I would just imagine maybe the mom is no longer focused on the career, but focused on being a mom. So maybe her priorities are out of sync in terms of a corporate environment, while a dude puts the pressure on himself of now he has to be a provider not only for his wife himself, but now the new mouth that he brought into the world.
Base differences in terms of the experience of childcare, I think are a remarkably important factor because ultimately you need two people to have a child. This tracks with the work of Dr. Matthias Dupke. He's like the guy to talk about family economics. It's his area of specialty. He talks about the differences between low fertility countries and ultra low fertility countries. In the countries that have the lowest levels of fertility, there is a clear trend of women taking on a greater percentage of the burden of childcare. So in the really low fertility countries, the percentage of childcare duties that is taken on by women can be as high as 80%. In countries that have slightly better fertility ratios, this percentage is much closer to 50-50. There's still a huge stigma in some of these countries, particularly South Korea and Japan, where women are still expected to spend huge amounts of time at home taking care of children, but they can't survive without having a career, or they simply just want a career, which is also very reasonable. The decision to have kids is, in some extent, a signal of optimism, right? A signal in the belief that you'll have a good future, your kid will have a good future, and the world on the whole has a good future ahead of it. And I think these disparate factors all play into a single idea of optimism about the world. There's a really good research group called Our World in Data. They're amazing. They compiled some data on how optimistic people feel about the world. And you can see that there's this concentration of rich, low fertility countries at the bottom of this graph. And I think it helps us at least explain somewhat why the countries that are even trialing just direct one-off cash payments are not seeing remarkable improvement. Giving someone a one-off payment doesn't necessarily make them feel like the world is going to be a better place in the next 5, 10, 15.
I just want to see this real quick. So 35% say the average is that things will get better. 27% say that it'll remain the same. So realistically, this is about 62% think that it's going to be same or better, while we have about 38, the rest of the 38 saying, we don't know, it may get worse. I definitely fall in this category. I think with technological improvements, I think, yes, life is messy, and it's kind of like this water where sometimes you get this nice still moment, and then life just gets crazy, water's flowing, we got waves, we got everything, and then it settles right back down. And during those times of settlement, I think every time throughout human history, we've just seen a growth of increased quality of living conditions. And that roughness, that rough water is the cultures rubbing against each other, figuring out what's right, what's wrong, who's going to prevail. And right now, we got some really rough waters, especially if we're taking that analogy or metaphor that I'm making. We planted over in UK, which is where seemingly this guy's at. So, with that being said, let's continue to hear what this guy has to say.
15 years.
Sorry for
On the other hand, places like Taiwan have tried extended maternity leave, and that hasn't worked because that has actually increased the risk for women. They're going to be out of the workforce for longer, and they're going to struggle to recover the income that they once had. There are these macro factors like the gender wage gap, which are kind of creating like a negative pressure, and it's not enough to balance that negative pressure. But importantly, it's also worth mentioning that a lot of the drop in fertility is actually a good thing. It represents that people have agency. People can actually choose whether or not to have children, especially women. In fact, we use the term fertility crisis when it's not really a fertility crisis, it's a worker crisis. Governments aren't trying to create self-actualized, happy, positive individuals. They're trying to create meat for the grinder.
Okay, well, that ended in a way that I really didn't expect. I do like that he brought up people having more agency in their life, but I'm just gonna to lean back on what I'm saying earlier is that I think there's so much. There's never one problem, right? It's not just having kid expensive, right? But it's also people having agency, choosing whether or not they want to have kids. But truthfully, if we're gonna be honest with ourselves, I think most people. I am 30, right? When I was in high school and I looked at a 30-year-old, that was somebody who was fully grown, who knew everything about the world and how it worked. And let me tell you, I know nothing. So why would and like I have my own insecurities, I have my own self-doubts, I have my own anxiety, and I feel like I'm not the only one with this. I just feel like I am at least more confident and more articulate enough to be able to, or like self-reflective enough to be able to articulate this. But I know I'm not the only one who's insecure about themselves, right? Who has self-doubts, whether it be in themselves or their relationship, right? And maybe they're not completely satisfied and you want to do more in life, or maybe you at least have the thoughts of it. So why, with that instability and insecurity right there, would you want to bring a kid who is the ultimate expression of you giving up selfness? At least it should. I know there's so many parents out there who have kids who are just shitty parents. When I become a parent, I will love that kid more than anything. I'm so blessed to have a wonderful mother and a wonderful father. And even though my parents are divorced, they're both still my best friend, and all of us can get along, and we can all go out to a restaurant and it not be weird and have good times and laugh. I am truly blessed for that, and I want to at least provide that for my next kid without the divorce, right? That's another thing too. It's like you get a kid, you're married, now that brings on another stress level to the relationship. And if you're in love with somebody and everything's going good, but things are definitely stressed, the straw that breaks the camel's back, well, what if it's a full-grown a baby and a mouth to feed, and how people want to raise kids now becomes another thing that gets added to the relationship mix of like, how are we going to raise this kid? How do you, how was your wife or husband, how were they raised? How were they disciplined? Do you agree with all of it? Does he agree with all of it? And like, I'm getting anxiety talking about this, and I hope you are too, so that feeling in your gut, we can sit there and understand, man, why would we want to bring a kid, something that's supposed to be pure and malleable, into this world of chaos and uncertainty right now? And I think that is a real root in fear, not the roots, right? Because roots, ultimately, there's a lot of different ones. But I think this is a thick boy in terms of a root that is causing this. And it's a shame that Fads didn't bring this up in his video. But if you guys want to, go ahead, go to his channel. He has 114K subscribers. Give him a like, give him a subscribe. It was a great video. I mean, the dude's well spoken. I enjoyed watching that. It made me feel some shit, and that's why we're reacting to it, and that's why you're hearing it from me. But if you did like the way the words are coming out my mouth, you're picking up what I'm putting down, like the video, subscribe, share this with your friends, see what they think. See if this is a talking point. It's always fun just to shoot the shit in game and just see what your homies have to say. But with that said, if you do game, you do want to join me live, I play Call of Duty, all the FPS shooters, really kind of any shooter. I like to pew and try not to get pew-pewed, but you join me live over on kick.com/Elrod. Join me over on, or follow me, over on x.com/actually-Elrod. And with that said, I'm going to catch you guys tomorrow or later tonight if you catch me live. Peace.